Hello, everyone. I just want to welcome you to the Ed Collab gathering. This is session 4, so we're almost through the day, and specifically, you're going to be taking a look at workshop number 15. This workshop is being presented by Gwen Hyman and Martha Schulman. Gwen is a past director of the Center for Writing at the Cooper Union and founder of Workshop Teaching. Martha is director of the Cooper Union Summer Writing Program and adjunct instructor of humanities at Cooper Union. They're actually both co-authors of Thinking on the Page, which is a college student's guide to effective writing, and that was actually published in 2015. Today, Gwen and Martha are going to be talking to you about writing methods for visual learners, and as always, you can feel free to join in on the conversation by tweeting at the hashtag that you see right there below my name. And the hashtag is EdCollabGathering. And then if you could put a space and then 15. And I'm going to be tracking those tweets throughout the workshop. And just one last kind of disclaimer. Gwen and Martha are kind of battling for bandwidth in their New York City apartment. So just pardon some graininess at times, but the workshop, I promise, will be very informative regardless. So with all that said, I'd like to turn it over to Gwen and Martha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Martha.
And I'm Gwen.
And as Ryan said, we wrote a writing handbook for college students called Thinking on the Page. And we just want to say first thanks to Ryan for that great introduction and how thrilled we are to be part of the Ed Collab gathering. We've already learned a lot today, and we're really grateful to Chris for inviting us and to all the Ed Collab crew for the support. And what we want to talk about today, there's 2 goals. One is hands-on learning techniques that make sense to all kind of learners. And the other is an inquiry-based approach to text that really privileges question asking and exploration and discovery instead of mastery. And why we think that's important is we've taught a lot of kids. They're visual learners, they're numeric learners, they're kinesthetic learners, and they think they're bad writers because they don't think like English majors. But we don't think that's a thing. We don't think there are bad writers. There are just writers who haven't found the techniques and approaches that work for them. So we've developed visually oriented, active learning approaches that allow all kinds of learners to use their learning styles as an asset. And what we're hoping is to get rid of this idea of the bad writer so that students see themselves as empowered because they have the tools they need. And that way we can challenge them and they can think hard and they can work on the page and the process is meaningful for them. So Gwen is going to tell you a little bit about what we mean when we say essay.
Hi. So when we talk about an essay, that's important to us because it relates very directly to the techniques that we're going to show you today. When most people think about student essays, they probably think about the old 5-paragraph model. But from our perspective, the 5-paragraph model is not actually all that useful. We don't actually use it at the college level at all. And we know from talking to teachers that many of you are frustrated at the high school and middle school level because you find it inadequate. And here's why we don't find it useful. We've created a dummy 5-paragraph essay on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is the text we'll be talking about today. So here, the student begins with a big statement. Death is important in Frankenstein. Well, that's true, but it's really general. It doesn't really show that the student has learned anything about the text. You know that if you know anything about the book. The student then gives us 3 examples of this big idea on the text, but she's not reading those examples closely because her purpose is just to confirm her big idea. So she's still not learning anything. And her conclusion restates the thesis, so there's no progression. She said one thing 5 times, and the thing that she said didn't require her to take any intellectual risks, to ask any questions, to do any analytical thinking. So instead of using the 5-paragraph model, which is, if you look at the slide, is basically a form of a circle, we like to think of the essay as a story that moves from one place to another. And you can see that in the slide that we've got up. So in this model, the introduction points a direction, but it doesn't give the whole game away. Each idea is built on the one that comes before. The meaningful connections between ideas are really central, and the conclusion shows what it all adds up to. This kind of essay is inquiry-based. That's the most important thing about it. It begins with a student's question about something specific in the text rather than with a certainty. And when I say begin, I mean in her process of writing the essay. The focus isn't on summarizing or generalizing about character or plot events or theme, but on analyzing specific places where the language and the events of the text don't quite match up. And the argument comes from the evidence, not the other way around. So we're not starting with a big idea. Instead, we're starting with something very specific. And I'm going to show you, I hope, what that looks like. Okay. So this is much less pretty than our other slides because I made it and not our gifted student who made all the other stuff. But what you'll see is we begin with the student noticing something weird in the text, something interesting that she doesn't understand. She asks questions about this thing in order to explore it. She makes discoveries through analysis. She figures out the implications of what she's discovered for this particular moment in the text. And maybe that's the end. Or maybe she then applies what she's figured out to a second passage and asks a new set of questions. Or maybe she thinks about the implications for a character or a topic or an issue in the text as a whole. And maybe she may even eventually think about what this shows her about the world the text is written into and out of, so that the text functions as a cultural document. So it's the opposite of the 5-paragraph essay. This means the student can't start the writing process for the essay with a claim already determined. She needs to begin by saying, here's something I don't understand. And then she needs to explore that thing. That is terrifying. It's especially terrifying for students because they are so accustomed to looking for correct answers. And we like to have some ground under our feet. We like to know what we're saying. Here, the student begins by admitting what she might well see as weakness, and then she has to figure that out through a process of writing. That requires inquiry, hard thinking, lots of discovery. It means it requires an approach that is much more active than the 5-paragraph essay approach. And for students who don't think like English majors, this can be really overwhelming. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to begin. So what we're going to do today is show you an approach to reading to write. We're beginning with the student's first read, and then we're going to move all the way through to getting ready to draft. And we're going to focus on very hands-on, visually oriented techniques. And if you find this interesting, we have an essay upcoming in Inside Higher Ed on this exact same topic. So we're going to look today at a passage from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I know that's a little bit small for you to read. It's a passage where Victor is conducting the experiments that led him to create his creature out of dead body parts. And in this passage at first read, Victor's talking about how he's going to go about the project of creating life. So what we ask students to do when we want them to read a passage for the first time, we ask them to begin with content. But often they only get the gist. They'll say, Victor is talking about dead bodies, and they'll miss everything else going on. So what we want to do is slow them down. And one way to do that is to mark up the text. And now I say that knowing that in middle school and high school, that's mostly not possible because the students don't own the book. Sometimes we'll have students photocopy a page if we want them to focus on that page when they're doing a first read. They can mark in a notebook, they can mark on the computer. The reason we like students to mark on the text is because it's immediate, it acts as a memory aid, and it also helps break down the authority of the text because if it's published, they think it's important and they can't speak back to it. So it breaks that down a little bit. So what we're asking them to mark are vocabulary words that they don't understand, key points, and questions or thoughts or ideas. And you can see here what that markup looks like. So in some places, the student has actually looked up a definition and thrown it in. In some places, she's just said, I don't know what this means. There's little bits of quick summary. Wherever she's highlighted, she's made a note, because the highlighting on its own isn't enough. She won't remember what it is that she's talking about. And the comments are super brief. And then when she stops reading, wherever that is, we ask her to do a wrap up. And that's a summary where she just looks back at the book and then says, okay, here's what I remember that seems important to me, and writes it down. The idea is not to recreate what she read line by line, or even to be perfect. What we want her really to do is make some choices about what seems interesting to her. So one kid may remember everything there is to remember about dead bodies in this passage, because that's what he paid attention to. Another kid may remember that Victor says that he's not superstitious, and that's why he's able to do this word. A third might focus on the science. This is the first step for kids in making choices, even if they're not aware that they're making those choices. And the wrap-up also serves to help kids remember what they've read, so it's another guide. And we really prefer that kids do this in writing rather than doing it on the computer, because for most kids, they absorb what they're doing more effectively. So Martha's going to talk a little bit about how to pick a passage.
Right. So at the college level, we often will let students choose their passage, but obviously in middle school and high school, we understand that it may be more effective for you to choose. So how do you choose? Well, one thing that's important to think about is we're not necessarily looking for a big, huge plot moment. And the reason for that is because plot is static. It happened, it didn't happen. We're looking for something where the language is really rich. And what we mean by that is there's multiple meanings, there's things that are maybe contradictory or interesting, there's something to get your feet into, get your hands into. So we're on the same passage that Gwen talks about. Victor's talking about his process. And what's interesting is there are a number of contradictions about it. He says he's very enthusiastic, but he also says it's almost intolerable. Well, which is it? He's turning to death to know about life, but aren't death and life opposites? Why is the one going to tell him about the other? The other thing that's interesting there is the syntax. There's a lot of passive voice. And as we as teachers know all too well, passive voice, we don't know who's doing anything, right? So that's a problem. Is Victor doing it? Who's doing it? So when we choose a passage, we're practicing with students. Notice what's odd. Notice what's interesting. Ask questions. Ask questions. And at first, this is very hard for them because they're used to thinking, well, if I don't understand something, it's me. I misread it. Or frankly, they may not even notice it because they've kind of just read past it. And this work where we're really choosing a passage and asking them to read closely, this work is about breaking those habits. So one of the things that we do here when we're working with a student is we type out the passage triple spaced with bigger margins. So I don't know if you can see this on the slide, but it actually is, there's more white space. And the reason for that is a lot of text, a lot of dense text, small type, can actually be really overwhelming for students, especially these days when they're used to seeing very small bits of text on a screen. The other reason we do it, and we actually ask them to retype it or rewrite it, is it's such an interesting way of getting the text into your body. It's a different interaction with the text. And what we like about that is that as you type it, you feel it. Oh, I just typed the same word 4 times. If this is so important that they're repeating it 4 times, maybe I should notice it. So they're having that different interaction. Another way that we like to get students to sort of have a variety of interactions with the text is we say, well, why don't you read it yourself, read it out loud, have someone else read it out loud. And why we like that is different people process information in different ways. And if students don't try out different things, or if they think reading out loud is for little kids or whatever, they don't know what works for them. And maybe there's something that works really well for them. So, because when they think they have only one option and they don't work that well with it, they tend to go back to, I'm a bad writer. So when we talk about close reading, one of the big things we do, we have a metaphor that we use, which is the metaphor of the magnifying glass, which I am going to show you as soon as I can make it reappear. So those are some previews of what you're going to see later. But here we have the magnifying glass. Everyone knows what a magnifying glass is, so it's very direct. And we just say, when you look at something through a magnifying glass, you can see more closely, right? The text is bigger. And this is what close reading does. What close reading does is it lets you look more carefully at something. So we're going to take a look at one sentence from our passage, and we're going to read it a little bit closely. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death, Victor says. Okay, so at first blush, when we first read it, sure. Victor knows what he's talking about. Victor's explaining his process. Why would I even stop and think, fine. If I slow down, think, wait, Victor, you want to know about life? You're looking for death? Looking at death? How do those go together? At that moment, the students are saying, Victor, I'm not sure I'm with you here. And that's a really important moment for them because they're interrogating the text rather than reading it passively. And that's what close reading does, and that's the germ of the essay. And Gwen's going to talk a little bit about another way to tell students about this.
I'm going to show you another picture. So I love this image, in part because it's a little bit silly, which makes it a little bit clearer, I think, for my students. I like to use this metaphor of the train. So in the first image, as you can see, the train and the tracks are together, as they should be. The train represents the plot. The tracks, the language that carries the events of the text. So if you're riding in the train or following along with the story, those two things work together. That means that as a reader and a writer, there's not much to say about it. When plot and language are working smoothly together, you can summarize, and maybe there are big issues, big general questions that come up through this coherent reading experience, but there's no questions about the text itself, really. But as you can see in the second image, that's not always the case. Here, imagine yourself riding along in the train and you happen to glance out the window, that is, slow down and read closely. You notice that the train is blithely moving along, but the tracks have gone off in some other direction. In other words, when you look closely, the language is no longer expressing the plot in a one-to-one correspondence. It's actually doing something else. And that's what we're looking for in close reading. What's strange, what doesn't make sense, the gap. And that's what we want students to explore, because it's an opportunity for them to move beyond plot, to ask questions about things they don't understand. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I work with this in class, one approach to reading to write. So what I like to do is I choose a passage and I retype it for the class as a handout in that triple-spaced form that Martha was talking about before. So there's big margins, there's lots of space on the page, and I hand it out. I ask the students, where are we in the text? What's going on? Because often when students are reading along in a text for class, they don't have a sense of which event follows which event. They get lost. So we clear that up, and then I tell the students to hold a pen in hand, and I read the passage out loud as they follow along. And I ask them to mark anything that strikes them. And that's because, as Martha said, sometimes things adhere when you hear them in a way that they don't when you read them to yourself. So then we take a moment again to come back together, and I ask the students to just summarize for me what we just read, what's going on here in terms of basic plot. And then I give them some time, 5-10 minutes, depending on the passage, to reread the passage to themselves, mark it up, and make notes. And I tell them that what they're looking for are things they're noticing now that they didn't notice before when they weren't close reading. And it's important to stress to them that there's no right answer. There's also no right question. There's no magic key to the passage. I just want to see what's interesting to them. I'm not looking for anything in particular. So what I ask them to mark are words with ambiguous meanings or those they're not totally sure of. And if you have computers in the classroom, it's great if they can look it up, especially if they have access to the OED. I tend to bring great big heavy dictionaries into class and have them share them. Questions that come up for them now that they're rereading, and ideas and connections. And it's important to remember this is a reread. They've read the book. Now we're coming back to this passage. So I give students, once they've done this, another 5 minutes to write down a list of questions based on their notes. And I tell them that all the questions count. There's not good ones or bad ones. Just throw them all on the page. Then identify the one that you think is most interesting, I tell them. Highlight it, circle it. Let's come back together. And we put a whole bunch of questions up on the board. And the reason we do that is that I want them to see that there's way more than one way to read a given passage. And there's more going on in that passage than they may think there is. It helps the kids feel more confident in looking for what they don't understand and in choosing things that are interesting to them. So it's all about short-circuiting that tendency to look for the answer that the teacher wants. It's also a good opportunity to show the students that it's not their job to fix the text. They tend to think that if there's something weird going on in the text, they're reading it wrong. And those are actually the moments that we want them to focus on. Problems in the text are opportunities. So we want them to understand that there's lots of ways of reading and that what they're reading for is what's strange or interesting or different. Figuring out questions to ask can be hard for students, for anyone. So I'm going to show you a couple of techniques for generating questions. I like to try these out in the classroom. I put them on the board. I have the students do their own, and then I have them do it at home and hand it in as a very, very low stakes or no stakes assignment so they get some practice with it, because I find they have to try this stuff over and over in order for it to really sort of get into their brain. And I want them to try out a bunch of different techniques because, as Martha said, students learn in different ways. So what works for one student will not work at all for somebody else. So these are some writing as thinking exercises in which I want them to think through their ideas on the page. The first one you have done 100 million times. It's a free write. I prefer to have students do it by hand. Again, because there's all this research on the connection between the hand and the page and the difference in doing that than working with a keyboard. But I have a student who can't read her own handwriting. She types. And students who tend to think very, very quickly are often more comfortable on the screen as well. I have students start with a very broad question, usually what's going on here? And I ask them to talk to themselves in one form or another. And this is great for students who are associative readers and associative writers. And what I mean by that are students who think like I do. I start by talking about Frankenstein. 25 pages later, I'm talking about cows. Connection between Frankenstein and cows, who knows? But I've created a whole lot of stuff in between. My challenge is to clarify, edit, make choices. So for associative readers, free writing is very easy. They're comfortable with it. It's a great tool for them. If you are a self-critical writer, that's a different story. A self-critical writer puts 3 words on the screen, deletes 2. Puts another word down, deletes it, stares at the screen. Self-critical writers have a lot of trouble getting language down. So it's great for them to brainstorm, go point, 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 because the stakes are really low. There's no real sentences. The grammar doesn't matter. You don't need to connect ideas. It's very quick. So that's great for them. Now, some other methods that are more visual. And for these methods, I really like to use big paper, like big poster paper, or preferably a whiteboard or blackboard. And I like to do that because students can get some perspective and step back and see what they're thinking. And seeing what they're thinking is a huge thing. And also they can spread their ideas out so they don't feel limited by the page. And the reason I like the whiteboard or blackboard is because you can erase it. So nothing is written in stone, stakes are very low, you can just mess around. It feels a lot more like play. So the first thing I'm going to show you here is what's called a wheel and spoke. So the wheel is the circle-ish thing around recourse to death. So you pull a phrase from the passage that you're interested in, a phrase that seems particularly interesting, and then you draw all of these spokes coming out from the wheel. And I sometimes will draw the circle and the spokes for my students because it's less overwhelming for them. And then you just throw questions down on the page. And one reason this works is that students tend to feel like, I have 8 spokes, I need 8 questions. It feels a lot less overwhelming than a blank page. And then we'll work with those questions later. This is great in particular for associative writers because it gets all of those churning ideas out of your head and lets you step back and look at them and say, I like this one, I don't like that one. Instead of self-editing and saying, I don't know. You might also try with self-critical writers in particular, a question-response question format. So you ask a question, respond to that question, and ask another question based on that response, and so forth. It follows the sort of digging down process that is essay writing, but it's very structured, which self-critical writers really like. So these two methods actually generate questions, so they're quite direct. I'm going to show you a couple that don't generate questions per se, but they're really useful when students are stuck because the stakes are so super low. There's no sentences, there's no real writing, but they're still working with language and ideas. So the first is free association. So here, the student starts with death, the word death, and death makes you think of ending, which makes you think of beginning, which makes you think of birth, right? Like the old psychologist game. I like to play this with my whole class because it inevitably ends somewhere ridiculous, but it also lets them see the kids who self-edit all the time, they'll go, and they won't be able to think of a word right away. And that tells you that this is actually a really useful exercise for them. It seems a little touchy-feely, but it pulls stuff out of your head because you have to think so quickly. The second is a mind map, which I'm sure some of you have seen. And this is basically free association. It's basically a free write in images. So you're just throwing ideas down on the page, drawing links between them. You are drawing your ideas in words. Once the student has generated some stuff, we like them to take a break so they get some perspective and then come back and take a look at what they've got and mark it up. So you can see here with this marked up wheel and spoke, the student has made some decisions about what's important. She's crossed stuff out, she's circled other stuff, she's written start here, she's drawn connections between ideas, and the next thing she might do is do some brainstorming right on the page below that bit that she's circled that seems really important. Or do a free write based on what she's got here, or pose some more questions. So she works with what she's got, makes some choices, gets rid of stuff that doesn't seem useful. So Martha is going to talk about what to do with all those questions now that you've got them.
Okay, so, as Gwen suggested, all of this is helping students not approach a blank page and do inquiry as far as questions go. So they've gotten some work on with these processes, but now they need to organize them. They need to actually start getting them in a way that makes sense to them, that they can organize. And so what we do is we have what we call the dialogic journal. And what that is a dialogue between the students and the text. And as you can see, there's 2 columns. On the left side, the students put quotes from the text, actual quotes, not paraphrases. And that's important because we want them to work with the language. On the right side, they put their questions, their ideas. What do they want to know about this? What is interesting about this? And they want to put that in the form of the question. And of course, they can use the notes that they made in the text. They can use the work that they did previous to this with the visual methods that Gwen talked about. A really important thing that we want to stress is to them, but also here, is anything that you write on the left side, it's because there was something you wanted to know about it. Something interested you. And so then you're going to go right then to the right side and ask your questions and think about it. Because if it turns out there's nothing you want to know about it, it shouldn't be there in the first place. If you don't write something on the right side, you've just made a list of the text. That's not useful. The right side is where the essay comes from. is what we always tell students, because that's your ideas. And of course, what that means is my dialogic journal may look very different from Gwen's dialogic journal on the same passage, which the kids find amazing because they think there's always only one way. So it's actually kind of nice to show that, because we have different interests. We're making choices. Not everything in the text is interesting or important to this reader, it may be to that reader. And that building choices is useful because it has that process of ownership. I'm asking questions because I want to know. It's great for self-critical writers because they think the text is the text. What more is there to add? It's there. It's self-explanatory. And this shows that they can really intervene with the text. They can ask a very simple question to start, and then maybe they take their question response question, put it right here, build on it, which is useful. Associative writers, it's great for them because, as Gwen said, the problem for associative writers is always to get out of their head everything that is spinning around there so that they can not be spinning, so that they can move forward. So that's why these are really useful. Now, sometimes you're working with a text that is just straight up hard. Shakespeare is immediately what comes to mind. So what we use there is a 3-column dialogic journal. Same thing on the left, quotes from the text. You can see it here on the slide. Same thing on the far right, which is your ideas and questions. In the middle, the student is paraphrasing. And that is huge because, for one thing, it's a really good check for them and for you. Do they understand what's going on? And that's a really big deal. The other thing that's really useful for them there is they can see the difference between summary and analysis. And that's important because, especially for students who are learning this process and it's still new to them, they're not always clear on what that looks like. And so when you can point and say, well, here you're just restating the text, and here you're doing something different, you're actually thinking, those are really different things, and that's useful for them to see. So the next thing I want to show you is, okay, what kind of things might you look at in a dialogic journal? So we have here this one line, not yet, we don't. Yes, we do. We have here this one line from the passage under question, and it's the first line in the sentence in the passage. And Victor says, unless I had been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to this study would have been irksome and almost intolerable. All right, so what's interesting about that? We always tell students, take a look at syntax. Now, that can sound intimidating to students, but here we have a very baseline syntax issue, which is it's passive voice. So that you've been talking to them about that. I don't know who does something when it's passive voice. Is it you? Is it a zombie? Who is it? So in this case, when Victor says I had been animated, and that's a great word, animated. Is Victor a cartoon? It immediately gives the students something to ask about, which is great. And okay, we also always tell students, think about the different meanings a word can have. So we all know what enthusiasm means. I'm enthusiastic about sports, but it turns out if the students look it up, that there's another meaning, which is a related meaning. But this idea that you've been overtaken by a passion for something, it's consuming you. Well, this raises the issue again of, oh, Victor, are you in charge of this whole process? So again, more questions to ask, more ideas to raise. And what's interesting about that is they're asking questions, obviously, right? So that's good. The other thing we say to look at is words that look alike and sound alike, but are in fact not alike. Irksome, it would have been irksome, this work, or it would have been almost intolerable. Well, which is it? Irksome is bothersome, it's a mosquito bite. Almost intolerable is I can't bear to do this. So suddenly the student is in dialogue with Victor. Victor, what are you thinking here? What's up? And that's great. It's a really useful thing to get students to think about. So if you note here, the student is not editing. Unrelated questions may turn up in the same box. That's fine. That's what the student is thinking about. The whole point of a dialogic journal is it's a way to organize a sustained interaction with the specifics of the text. And that's what we want, because that's what builds an essay. So Gwen's going to talk a little bit about questions here.
So we've been talking about questions in different ways all the way through, but I want to talk about the ways that questions are not all, unfortunately, created equal. So what we're looking for when we look at questions, and again, I'm just going to say, when students are generating questions, every question is a good question. But when students are still trying to, once students have generated those questions, then they have to start making choices. What are the questions I'm going to focus on? And Martha's going to talk a lot later about that focus. But what we're looking for to begin with are questions that have at least two sides and require specific evidence from the text. We don't want questions that are general. We want questions that stay close to the text, that come out of the text and take you back to it in order to figure things out. And we want questions that are, most importantly, analytical, that help students investigate something that seems strange or interesting. So let's go back to that slide. Some pitfalls to watch out for when you're talking about questions. Yes, no questions are questions that are easily answered in the text. Is Victor really getting body parts from graves? Well, yeah, that's in the book, so there's no analysis needed. Generalizations with assumptions in them. Victor is clearly a tragic hero. How does that affect what he does? So we're beginning with an unfounded assumption and then asking a big generalization. This is a perfect 5-paragraph essay question. There's no close reading or specifics. One-sided questions or fake questions. These are my favorites. Isn't Victor really playing God? The answer is inherent in the question. It's like being at a conference and listening to somebody ask a question that is not a question. It just allows you to say the thing that you already think. And Martha's favorite, the rewriting the text question. What if Frankenstein were a woman? We're in a whole different book now. And finally, biography in place of analysis. Is this really about Mary Shelley's miscarriage? There is a whole school of academia that works on these kinds of questions, but that's not what we're asking students to do, because it's really a kind of right answer question that leaves the text behind. You're not starting from something specific in the text and investigating it. You're looking at something else. So Martha's going to talk about what to do with these questions once you've started figuring out which ones you want to keep.
Right. So you have your dialogic journal, and maybe you've gone through, now that you have a better sense of what kind of questions work and what kind of questions maybe aren't that productive, and you have weeded them out. So that can be very useful. Your next move is to organize those questions into something that you can go deeper with. That's too long. Let's do so. Your next move, sorry, I have some slide difficulties here. I do really appreciate your patience with me. What I want to show you is what we call threading the dialogic journal. So you can see your idea threads, and that's what is now up. Yay. Okay, so the passage is a unit, right? It speaks to itself. So the questions and the ideas that students have brought up in their dialogic journal, there's going to be things that come out that are linked, that are connected. So what you do is you color code. We love highlighters. You color code and you say, okay, everything here I'm talking about is about whether Victor is in charge or is not in charge. Who's in charge of this whole show? Red. I'm coloring that red. Here, this is where I'm trying to figure out what Victor thinks about life and death. Coloring that blue. Great. That also, if there's something that's not colored or you just think, meh, maybe you cross that out, because that opens you up to be more focused on what you're interested in. So how do you choose which thread you're going to pursue? Well, the two easiest ways are what's most interesting to you / where do you have the most stuff, which are probably the same, or which fits best with the prompt that your teacher has given to you, right? Which is something, it's important for students to keep in mind. So what happens now is we have the students go back to the text, but what we do is we first say, let's go back to the magnifying glass. We're going to take our magnifying glass back to the text, but this time we're going to preload it with our thread idea. Oh, and by the way, something I should have mentioned, we name the threads. We name the threads, and that's important because it lets us concretize. This is what I'm thinking about. This is what I now know. So we take our named thread. We've decided to focus on this idea of Victor's responsibility. And we go back and we take it to the text and we look through that. And what that means is we see what we can see new once we know what we're looking for. So before we looked at Victor's responsibility, which is in red. But now I'm going to look at something that I thought was a blue idea, which is recourse to death. Now we talked about, whether they talked about it or not, who knows, but it's here. I look at it and I think, oh, I must have recourse to death. Well, must is the similar idea to responsibility. There's only one way to do it. It adds a nuance. Before we had him not in charge. Now that he must do it this way, oh, he has no choice. So what happens here, the more we collect data on this, the more we're starting to see that what we first were reading when we were just going along with what Victor wanted us to think and what Victor thinks, we can complicate that and we can interrogate that because we're looking closely at the text. And so this whole process of applying the thread, seeing what I see, going back to the text, it keeps me questioning, keeps me opening my ideas. I can deepen my thinking. I can always go back and use the techniques. Now that I'm looking at recourse to death differently, I can do another wheel and spoke if I want to. And so that is a tremendous amount of power of information that they can gather and questions they can pursue.
So we still haven't at this point written an essay. And I'm having some technical issues here because we seem to have changed this screen around somehow. There we go. We're going to wrap it up pretty quickly, but I'm just going to talk for a minute about approaching that essay. So there's no one way to start drafting. This is another place where it's good for students to try things out and develop an approach that makes sense for their learning styles. What's important is that you're moving towards something that is a narrative. So a student might begin writing the paper not at the beginning, but at the part he's figured out and work forward or backward from there. Or he might be the kind of student who works best with an outline. So he might decide that he's going to do what we call a flowchart outline. We like this better than the numbered outline with the numbers and the Roman letters because it emphasizes the connections between ideas. And that's what those arrows are for. And it moves in a straight line so that it's not a list, it's a narrative. He might also want to make some pictures accompanied by language or a storyboard like you would for a movie. These images, unfortunately, don't have language with them because they come straight out of our book and the language is on the other page. But it's important that students are writing as well as drawing so that they don't have to translate back from drawing, which is a different language, into writing. But all of these methods are aimed at creating something that is a coherent narrative that moves from one piece to the next. So by the final draft, the writer has done some stuff. She's looked at a phenomenon, she's asked questions about it, she's done some analysis, and she's figured out the implications of that analysis. And then she takes the reader through what she's learned in a cleaned up version of that process. And there's a lot more about that in our book because this has been super fast.
So we just want to end by kind of reiterating something we've been saying here, which is what we're talking about is student-centered, inquiry-based learning, and that's important not only in the classroom, but in the world. We want students to be able to think, to be able to ask questions, to be able to know what they think and why they think it. And so this is about taking risks and making the class a place of discovery. So we want to just emphasize that and the openness of it and the empowerment that it brings. And we want to thank Chris and all of EdCollab and especially Ryan Dunbar for our tech support because as you can see, we need it. And if you want to be in touch with us about any of these ideas later on, we would love to hear from you. Email address, Twitter handle, website, And thank you so much for spending this time with you. We hope it was helpful, and enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gwen and Martha. I was getting a lot of tweets during your session, and most of them were complimentary, and a lot of people had some good ideas. I was just going to ask you kind of one quick question, if that's okay?
Yep.
Cool. So I was wondering, as I watch, and I'm like actually like taking notes the whole time and following tweets the whole time, because I do teach high school English, and I know there are a lot of high school, probably English teachers out there watching this that are curious about this process in terms of what happens with a complex process like this when a student kind of struggles, because I feel like a lot of it is very complex. So do you have any tips for that quickly, if students are struggling to do this type of work?
So we're throwing 100 million things at you. But when we're working with students on this stuff, we really do this piece by piece. And there's a couple of ways to work with students who struggle on this, which is, those are the students who are close to our heart. So the first is that we don't give them everything at once. We will be having a discussion in class, and we'll say, okay, you guys, everybody, we're going to do a wheel and spoke because I want you to come up with some questions. So it becomes part of the classroom process, right? Everybody try it. Okay, did you have some questions? Let's talk about what those questions are. And then when students, so we do this bit by bit, and we repeat it all the time so that students are beginning to sort of get those techniques into their bones. And then part of the drill, unfortunately, is that grading and student response and student meetings take a lot of time. It's really important to us when we are responding to student work to give each student specific possibilities, right? To say to the student, try this out because I think this is where you're having some trouble. And to really sort of stay on top of the process, would you say?
Yes, and another thing that maybe is worth saying is students can help each other with this.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do a lot of I think especially pair work in this moment, because then there's two heads generating questions. And maybe one of the heads is remembering, oh, that kind of question is taking us out of the text. And so there's a lot of give and take. And one of the big things we always stress, and especially because we teach first year writing, and so it's all about this transition, but you can stress it in your classroom too, this is new. This is new, this is hard. And it's supposed to be hard,
yeah,
which is a weird thing, right? But like, a lot of our students come to college and they actually don't, one of the reasons they think they don't like writing is because they think it's a formulaic thing. And what we say is, hey, I get why you didn't like that. I'm going to give you a new thing. It's going to be harder at first, but you're going to have something that comes out of it at the end.
Yeah, and I think it's validating that experience, I think, is so important, because there are so many kids who think they're the only ones.
Yes.
And that writing should be easy, and that for some people it emerges like Athena fully formed out of your head. And we all know that's not true.
Yeah, no, but thank you so much, because honestly, like, as I'm watching this, I'm thinking about a lot of the issues like I have with essay writing, and I'm sure a lot of other teachers out there are thinking about how they can improve their essay writing based on this model, because I really like how it's organic, it's student-centered, inspires curiosity, which has been a theme of today's workshop. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And for everybody watching, I hope you enjoy the rest of the workshops for today. I'm just going to share with you quickly so you could see everything that's coming up. Really, all we have left now is just going to be our closing presentation by Kate Roberts and Maggie Roberts. And it's the right tool for the job, practical planning to bring big ideas to life. So I'm definitely going to be tuning into that in about 10 minutes. And I hope you do too. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you enjoyed the previous ones as well. Have a great day.